Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was late one evening when I stumbled upon it. The kind of evening where the sky hangs heavy with the weight of the coming night, and the city feels quieter than usual. I was walking home from the bookstore, taking a longer route through some unfamiliar side streets. I liked to explore different parts of the city on foot, finding new nooks and crannies that I hadn't noticed before. It was peaceful, the low hum of the city just a distant murmur, and I was letting my thoughts wander. As I turned a corner, I found myself on a narrow street I hadn't seen before. It wasn't listed on my map, and I'd walked this area several times, so I knew that it wasn't part of my usual routes. The street was winding, lined with tall, weathered buildings that seemed old, but not in the charming, historic way. More like forgotten relics, standing silently, watching as the world around them moved on. The street was dimly lit, the glow from the street lamps barely cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in. The air was thick, wet from the evening's drizzle, and a shiver ran down my spine as I took in the eerie stillness. I hesitated for a moment, but something about the street drew me in. Maybe it was the quiet allure of it, the odd feeling that I had discovered something hidden, something out of place. Without really thinking, I stepped onto the cobblestone path, the sound of my footsteps soft but distinct in the silence. As I walked further, I noticed something strange. The buildings on either side of the street weren't just old, they were wrong. It wasn't just their age or their disrepair. It was the way they seemed to distort the light, bending shadows around corners that shouldn't have been there. The windows were dark, but the faintest flicker of movement caught my eye, like someone or something was watching from behind the glass. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, I noticed something else. The street didn't seem to go anywhere. It curved gently ahead, but there was no sign of an end. No intersection. No other roads branching off. It was as if the street stretched on forever, wrapping itself around the city like a forgotten thread in a forgotten part of the world. I paused. Something wasn't right. I looked behind me, but the street I had just come from, where I had turned the corner, was gone. It was as though the street had erased itself, leaving me standing alone in the middle of nowhere. The buildings on either side of me stretched up, their silhouettes looming ominously in the dim light. I turned back down the street and kept walking, more quickly now, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in my chest. But the farther I walked, the less I recognized. The buildings grew taller, more oppressive, and the fog seemed to grow thicker, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. And then, it happened. I reached the end of the street tour, what I thought was the end. It was a small square, the buildings surrounding it like silent witnesses. At the farthest corner of the square, there was a street sign. I squinted at it, trying to make out the name, but the letters were blurred, as if the street itself refused to acknowledge its existence. My heart skipped a beat. The name on the sign, it was one I had never seen before. Dunsmore Lane, I had never heard of. It didn't exist on any map, not in this part of town, not anywhere. But here it was, clear as day. I reached out to touch the sign, but as soon as my fingers brushed against it, the world around me seemed to shift. The square, the buildings, they began to distort, to blur, like the scene was melting, warping before my eyes. I stepped back, disoriented, and when I looked again, the street was gone. The fog was still thick around me, but the square had vanished. I was standing at the same corner I had been before, the cobblestone street stretching ahead of me, just as it had when I first turned onto it. The buildings were the same, but the street had returned to its original shape, like nothing had ever changed. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My pulse was racing, my breath shallow. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? But no, there was the street, the same one I had turned onto, the one that didn't exist, the one that shouldn't have been there. I looked around again, my gaze searching for any sign that I had missed something, but the street was empty. The fog had thinned, and the world outside seemed far more familiar, far less strange. I felt a knot in my stomach, unsure whether to continue walking or turn back. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of the night press down on me, I heard it. A faint sound, a distant echo of footsteps, soft and measured, as though someone was walking just behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. The street was still quiet, still empty. I didn't wait to find out who or what was following me. I turned around and walked quickly back toward the main road, the sound of my own footsteps ringing in my ears. The street seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, and every turn I made felt like it was leading me further away from where I had started. But after what felt like an eternity, I finally found myself back at the corner where I had first wandered in. The familiar streetlights, the usual hum of the city, all of it returned, grounding me back into the real world. I paused for a moment, looking back over my shoulder at the empty, fog-choked road. It was as if the street had never been there at all. No sign of it. No trace, nothing. I haven't walked down that street again. I don't know if it still exists, or if it was ever meant to. But whenever I'm out walking late at night, I sometimes find myself looking for it again, wondering if I'll come across it once more, and deep down, I wonder if it only appears when it wants to, when it chooses you. I don't know what it means, but I know I'll never forget the feeling of a street that disappears during the day. I had been walking down the same narrow, dimly lit alley for months, maybe even years, and I had never given it much thought. It was just one of those places you pass through without noticing. Tucked away between two old buildings, its entrance barely wide enough for a person to slip through. The alley itself was silent, almost forgotten, with the scent of wet stone and old graffiti hanging in the air. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely. It wasn't a part of the main street, not a place people typically ventured. Unless they had a reason to, most of the shops on the main street weren't even aware of it. The alley tucked away behind the row of stores, hidden from the bustle of the city. That's why I had never thought twice about it, even though I passed it so often. It didn't matter that it had a strange, almost oppressive feeling when I walked by it. I had simply gotten used to it, but that night something was different. I don't know what made me pause at the entrance, but I did. It wasn't intentional. It was like I was pulled toward it, a subtle tug in the back of my mind, urging me to look down the narrow path. As I did, I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the alley, just beyond the first bend, near the shadow of the old brick wall. I couldn't see her face at first, but I noticed her figure tall and rigid, her posture almost militaristic, as though she were guarding something, keeping watch. I don't know why, but I felt an instinctual discomfort. A sense that I wasn't supposed to be there, that I had stumbled into something I didn't understand. She didn't seem to move, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had just imagined her. But no, her form was unmistakable. She wore an old, long coat that seemed to blend into the shadows, almost as if it were a part of the alley itself. Her hair was long and dark, pulled back into a loose knot at the back of her head, and she stood perfectly still, as if she were waiting for something or someone. I stood there, frozen, watching her. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized I hadn't seen anyone enter or exit the alley before. And yet, here she was. A figure I had never noticed before, standing alone at the end of a place I had passed by countless times. The strange thing was, I couldn't look away. Something about her presence kept me rooted to the spot. I felt drawn to her, compelled to find out why she was standing there, in the exact same spot, as though she belonged there, as though she had always been there. I took a cautious step forward, trying to get a better look at her, but just as I moved, she shifted. Not toward me, but slightly to the side, positioning herself as if she were about to speak or stop me. Her movement was so fluid, so controlled, it almost didn't seem human. For a second, I thought I heard a faint whisper, like a murmur carried by the wind, but I couldn't make out the words. I stopped, my breath shallow, my feet rooted to the ground. My instinct told me to leave, to turn around and walk away. But something about her held me in place, kept me from moving. "Do you see me?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the silence of the alley. I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. I wasn't sure how to respond, or if I even should. The words hung in the air, thick with something I couldn't place. "You shouldn't be here," she continued, her tone almost gentle, but the warning was unmistakable. "This place is not meant for you." I didn't understand what she meant. I had walked by this alley countless times without giving it a second thought. It was just an alley, one of many that crisscrossed the city, dark and narrow. But now, as I stood there, I realized something unsettling. I had never really seen it before, never truly looked at it. Not until now. She stepped forward, her presence filling the space between us like a thick fog. I could make out the faint outline of her face now, but there was something strange about it. Her eyes were too wide, her expression too calm. It wasn't a look of malice, but something else, something ancient. She wasn't like anyone I had ever seen before. And then I understood. She wasn't just standing in the alley, she was guarding it. Her very presence seemed to hold the place in a kind of suspended silence, as if nothing could pass through without her allowing it. "Why?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling despite myself. "Why are you here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing in a way that made me feel small, insignificant. Her gaze pierced me, and I felt the weight of her attention as though I were under a magnifying glass. "This alley," she began slowly, her voice almost too quiet, "is not for wandering feet. It is not for you or anyone else to claim." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. "It has been here long before you, and it will remain long after. The ones who come here, they are not meant to walk freely. They are meant to stop. Her words didn't make sense. I had no idea what she meant, what she was trying to convey. But that feeling, the pressure, the heavy air, the unease, it didn't go away. It clung to me, wrapping around me like a cloak. I took a step back, unsure of what I was doing, but something inside me told me to leave. The alley, once just a forgotten path, had become something else entirely. A boundary, a place beyond my reach. Her gaze followed me as I stepped backward, her eyes never leaving mine. I didn't turn my back on her, not fully. I kept my eyes on her as I slowly backed out of the alley, the shadows shifting around me like they were alive. And when I reached the corner, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't take that alley again. I haven't. Even now, I'm not sure what I saw or why she was there, standing guard over that forgotten place. But every time I walk by, I feel her presence lingering in the back of my mind. She guards an alley no one else can see, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still waiting for me. I was walking home late one night, the kind of night where the streets feel empty, the city too quiet for its own good. The streetlights cast long shadows, flickering on the cracked pavement as the usual hum of traffic was replaced with an eerie stillness. It had been a long day at work, and I just wanted to get home, curl up in bed, and forget the rest of the world. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You know that feeling when you sense something out of place, but you can't pinpoint what it is? That was the kind of night it was. I cut through a side street I didn't usually take, a shortcut that wound through a quieter part of the city. This area always felt abandoned to me, old buildings, vacant storefronts, and an eerie emptiness in the air. The kind of place that looked stuck in time, like it hadn't seen anyone for years, despite being so close to the rest of the city. As I walked past the half-dead streetlights and cracked sidewalks, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was an old phone booth at the far end of the street, tucked into a corner near a brick wall, surrounded by the dark, damp shadows of the alley. I knew I'd walked down this road dozens of times before, but this phone booth was metal frame rusty, the glass cracked, like it had been forgotten by time itself. It shouldn't have been there. Curiosity pulled me closer, even as my instincts told me to keep walking, to ignore it, and go on my way. But something about the booth, something about its presence in the middle of an otherwise empty street, tugged at me. I was still a few feet away when I heard it. The phone rang. At first, I thought it was some random noise, maybe from a nearby apartment or some distant street. But no. The ringing was coming from the phone booth. Loud, clear, unmistakable. I froze. I couldn't explain why, but the ringing filled the empty space around me, echoing in my head. I glanced around, but there was no one else on the street. Just me and the booth, the ringing getting louder. I took another step forward, then another, until I was standing right next to the booth. I don't know why I did it, but I reached out and pulled open the door. The booth smelled old, stale air mixed with a faint, metallic scent of rust. The phone itself was hanging off its receiver, swaying slightly as if someone had just hung up. But the sound of it ringing, the persistent, insistent ring, wouldn't stop. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there, staring at the phone. I glanced down at the display on the booth, but there was no dial tone, no number, on the screen. Just that steady, ringing noise that wouldn't stop. I reached for the receiver, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The second my hand touched the cold plastic, the ringing stopped. And then, in the silence, a voice came through the receiver. "Hello? Is this you?" My blood ran cold. My heart stuttered. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't mine. It was my voice, but it wasn't me. The words were too distant, too distorted, like they were coming from a different version of me, from a time that hadn't happened yet. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My throat felt dry, my mind spinning, as if I was frozen in time, unable to move. The voice continued. "Why did you answer? Why did you pick up?" I could feel the sweat beading on the back of my neck, my fingers still clutching the receiver. I wanted to slam the phone back down, to run away, but something held me there. Something deep inside that told me I had to listen. The voice on the other end spoke again, this time more urgently. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't have come back." I staggered back, the receiver slipping from my fingers, but I didn't let go. I was trembling, my body locked in place, unable to look away from the booth. The ringing had stopped, but the voice lingered in my mind, echoing like a warning. I didn't understand. "You're not supposed to hear this," it said. "Not yet. Not now. But it's too late, and you can't leave." I dropped the receiver back onto the phone's base, the echo of the voice still hanging in the air. The world felt strangely distant as I stepped away from the booth, my heart racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't take my eyes off. The phone? I was frozen there, watching as if I expected it to ring again. But the booth was silent now. The street was silent. Everything felt still, as though the moment had stretched into infinity. I turned and walked away, my legs weak, my mind swirling with confusion. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the booth fading into the night, vanishing like a mirage. But it didn't. It was still there, its door hanging slightly open, the shadows swallowing it whole. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't even look for the booth again, though something inside me knew it would be there, waiting for the next time. But every time I think back to that night, I can still hear the voice faint, far away, like it's calling from somewhere I don't belong. I don't know who was on the other end of that phone. I don't know what it meant, but I do know one thing. I shouldn't have answered. And I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for me to pick up. And now, I wonder, who was calling me? It started as a simple decisional way to clear my head after a stressful week. I was walking home from work, the usual route, when I decided to take a different path, one that I hadn't noticed before. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the city, and I was in no particular rush. The streets were quieter than usual, the hum of traffic fading as the evening settled in. I turned down a side street that I hadn't explored, curious to see where it led. The street signs were old, faded by years of weathering, but they caught my each one pointing in a direction I hadn't expected. A few steps in, I noticed something strange, a small street sign at the corner, barely visible under the dimming light, with an arrow pointing right, and the word "Next" etched in faded black letters. Next, it wasn't a street name, it was just Next. But it piqued my curiosity. I thought, why not? I shrugged off the strange feeling creeping at the edges of my mind and followed the arrow. The road ahead was narrow, tucked between old buildings that seemed to close in around me. The further I walked, the quieter it became, the sounds of the city fading until I was walking in almost complete silence, save for the soft crunch of my footsteps on the uneven pavement. Then, after a few more blocks, I saw another sign. It was a simple one, like the first, trusted and worn but still legible. It pointed straight ahead and read, "Turn left." I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to follow, but I did. I turned left, thinking it was just a quiet detour that would eventually bring me back to the main streets. But as I continued walking, something felt off. The buildings around me had a strange familiarity to them, old, forgotten places, like they were relics from another time. They didn't look like the buildings I was used to seeing in this part of town, and I realized I hadn't passed a single familiar landmark since I turned down the street. And then, I saw another sign. This one was positioned further down the road. Its paint chipped, but the words were clear, "Turn right." I looked around, confused. This wasn't the city I knew. The street was getting narrower, the corners of the buildings casting deep shadows. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. My heart started to beat a little faster. What was going on? Was this some kind of game? A trick of the mind? I didn't know, but I didn't feel right, despite the unease building in my chest. I turned right. The road was practically deserted now, and as I walked, the air grew colder, a damp chill hanging in the air. It felt like the world was closing in on me, like I had walked into a space that didn't belong to the real world anymore. I tried to shake off the anxiety creeping up on me and focused on the next turn, hoping to find some clue as to where I was going. And there it was again, another sign. This one said, "*Go back." I stopped dead in my tracks, a cold wave of confusion washing over me. What did it mean? The streets around me had become unfamiliar. The buildings that lined the road now seemed taller, more imposing, their windows dark and empty. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen any people. It was as if I had stepped into some place that existed outside of time. I hesitated, then turned around, trying to retrace my steps. The street behind me was different, too like I had never been there. I walked a few steps back, trying to follow the path I had just taken, but I couldn't recognize anything. The street signs had changed, now directing me in ways that didn't make sense. The same sign that had told me to turn right earlier now told me to go straight. The one that had told me to turn left was gone altogether. I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't just lost, I was stuck. The streets seemed to wind in on itself, looping me in endless circles. Every time I turned a corner, I found myself at a place I had already been, a place that shouldn't be there. The street signs were the same, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just pointed, over and over, like they were taunting me. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. No one on the street, no cars passing by, no sound of life around me. Only the soft rustle of the wind pushing through the empty alleys. The panic in my chest grew, but there was no escaping it. No way to turn back. It was then that I saw the sign again. It had appeared on the corner just ahead, like it had been waiting for me. This time, it wasn't just an arrow. It was a full, bold message. "*You've gone too far." My heart skipped a beat, my legs frozen in place. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. There was no answer. There was no one here, no one to help me, and nowhere to go but forward, deeper into this maze of streets that made no sense. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the sign, my mind racing for a solution, a way out. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps once more, but everything had shifted again. The buildings were no longer just old and forgotten, they were new somehow, but not in the way I expected. They were unfamiliar, foreign. The street, which had felt endless, now felt like a lupa trick of the mind, or something worse. The last sign I saw before I lost myself completely was simple. Just a single word, etched into the pavement in faded white paint. *end. I haven't been able to find that street again. No matter how many times I try to retrace my steps, no matter how many times I think I've found the way, it disappears before I can reach it. The signs, the turns, they only lead me in circles, trapping me in a loop of streets I can't escape. Sometimes, I wonder if the street was ever really there at all. But every so often, I'll walk down a new road, and I'll catch a glimpse of something in the distance. Just out of the corner of my eye, a faint outline of a street sign, waiting for me to follow it again. And though I try to ignore it, I know, deep down, that one day I'll take that path again. I just hope I'm ready for what happens next. It was late afternoon when I stumbled upon the fountain, the kind of golden hour when the light turns soft and warm, and the world seems to slow down just a little. The park was quiet, almost empty. It was the kind of day where everyone had gone home, where the usual chatter of families and friends was replaced with the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of the city. I'd come for a walk, to clear my mind after a long week, and I found myself wandering down paths I'd never noticed before. That's when I saw it. The fountain wasn't on my usual route. It was tucked away in a small clearing near the edge of the park, behind a row of thick, overgrown bushes. The stone structure was old, crumbling a little, with vines crawling up the sides and moss gathering in the corners. The basin at the bottom was empty, completely dry, the stone cracked and weathered. There was something wrong about it, something that made the place feel forgotten. I stopped for a moment, my curiosity piqued. There was no plaque, no sign, no indication that this was anything other than an abandoned piece of the park. But there was a woman sitting at the edge of the fountain, her figure almost blending into the surrounding shadows. She was dressed in a long white dress, the fabric flowing like it was caught in an invisible breeze. Her hair was dark, falling in waves over her shoulders, and she sat with her back to me, staring into the empty basin. Her hands rested lightly on the stone edge of the fountain, fingers delicate, almost as if she were waiting for something or someone. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to approach. Something about her presence was magnetic. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't that she was especially striking or out of place. It was more that she seemed like part of the fountain itself, part of the emptiness that surrounded it. She looked so still, so absorbed in whatever thoughts held her there, and I found myself drawn to her, even though I had no reason to be. I walked closer, my footsteps almost too loud in the silence. As I reached the fountain's edge, I hesitated, unsure whether to speak, to interrupt whatever quiet world she was lost in, but before I could decide, she turned her head, slowly. her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You see it too, don't you?" she said, her voice soft, barely a whisper carried by the breeze. I was taken aback by the suddenness of her words, by how calm and composed she sounded, despite the oddness of the situation. "See what?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. She nodded toward the fountain, her gaze distant again, like she was looking at something far beyond the stone basin. "The water, it should be there, it's always been there. But it's gone now." I glanced at the empty basin. It was just that empty, nothing but dry stone and patches of green. There was no sign of water, no indication that it had ever held anything other than dust and dirt. I looked back at her, unsure how to respond. There was something unsettling about the way she spoke, as if she wasn't just referring to a fountain, but to something far deeper, something lost in time. "The water's always been here," she continued, her voice almost melancholic now. "But they took it. They took it, and it's never coming back." I glanced around, as if expecting to see someone else, someone who could explain this. Strange moment, but the park was still and quiet, empty, except for the two of us. I stepped a little closer to the edge of the fountain, peering into the dark stone, and I could almost see the water, flowing, rippling gently in the basin, like a memory that had been pushed too far into the corners of my mind. But the moment I focused on it, it disappeared, fading into the emptiness again. I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't sure what to say to someone who spoke with such conviction, who seemed to believe in something that was beyond the ordinary. "Why is it empty?" I asked quietly. She met my gaze again, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she had been waiting for me to ask that question. "Because it's not meant to be filled anymore," she replied, almost as if it were a secret. "It was never meant to hold anything, not anymore." I felt a sudden heaviness in the air, as if the world had grown a little more silent, a little more oppressive. The fountain, once a symbol of life, of water flowing freely, now felt like an empty shell, a relic of something forgotten, something lost. "I think I should go," I said, feeling the unease creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure if she heard me, though. Her attention had drifted again, back to the empty basin. Before I could turn and leave, she spoke one last time. "The water doesn't leave willingly," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if the words were for herself. "More than for me. But when it's taken, it never comes back. And neither do you." I froze, a cold chill running down my spine. The finality of her words hung in the air like a curse, and I knew then that I couldn't leave the same way I had come. Something had shifted, something had been left behind. But when I turned to walk away, I felt her eyes on me, even though she had turned back to the fountain, staring into the empty basin once more. And in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just seen her sitting there. I hadn't just found her by chance. I felt as though she had been waiting for me. I haven't returned to that part of the park since that day. I don't know why, but there's something about that fountain, the way it waits, silent and empty, that I can't seem to forget. Every time I walk through the park now, I feel a pull toward it, an urge to go back, to see if it's the same. But every time, I remember the last words she said to me, and I walk away. I walk away because I know that whatever she was guarding, whatever was lost in that fountain, doesn't want to be found. And maybe, just maybe, it's not meant to be. It wasn't the kind of place I usually visited, an old museum, tucked away in a forgotten part of the city. The kind of place you only stumble upon when you're lost or desperate to find something new. Something different from the hustle and chaos of everyday life. I had seen the small sign, faded and barely noticeable, the one that pointed down an even narrower street, and out of curiosity, I decided to check it out. The air was thick with the scent of age dust, old wood, and the faint, musty smell of ancient things. As I entered, the heavy wooden door creaked shut behind me, sealing me in with the quiet, almost reverent atmosphere of the place. There was no one at the front desk, no ticket taker. It was as though the museum had been abandoned, left to its own silence, and I was the only one there. The soft click of my shoes against the floor echoed in the hall as I walked deeper into the building, the walls lined with paintings that looked centuries old, and sculptures that seemed to stare at me with empty eyes. The dim lighting made it hard to make out the finer details of the exhibits, but there was something captivating about it. The museum was small, much smaller than I had expected. The rooms were filled with relics, objects of history, ornate things that seemed to belong to another time, another world. I wandered from room to room, fascinated by the oddness of it all. But it wasn't until I reached the back of the museum, where the older exhibits were housed, that I came across the statue. It was standing in the far corner of the room, partly obscured by shadow, a tall figure draped in what appeared to be ancient robes. The face was smooth, almost featureless, but there was something unnerving about the way it stood, its posture rigid and commanding. It looked like it belonged to a different era entirely, a time when statues were created to honor gods and rulers, to immortalize people in stone. This one, though, felt different. It felt alive. I stood in front of it, staring up at its towering form. The more I looked at it, the more it felt as if the eyes, though made of stone, were following me. I shook the thought away, telling myself it was the lighting, the way the shadows played tricks on the mind. I wasn't superstitious, and I didn't believe in ghost stories or curses. But there was something undeniably strange about this statue. It felt as if it was waiting for something, watching me. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard something, faint scraping sound, like stone shifting against stone. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The room was still. No one else was there. My pulse quickened, and I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone moving, and that's when I saw it. The statue's head just slightly It wasn't a dramatic movement, nothing that would make anyone think the statue had come to life, but it was enough. The head, which had been perfectly still, had turned ever so slightly, as if it had followed my movement. A subtle shift, but undeniable. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the way I had been standing, the way the light hit it, had somehow made it look like the statue had moved. But no, there was something about it that felt real. It was as if the statue had somehow acknowledged me, its stony face now facing directly in my direction. I took a hesitant step back, my feet almost unwilling to move, and the head shifted again. This time, it was more pronounced. It was as though the statue was not just looking at me, but observing me, studying me. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow. There had to be some logical explanation. It was an old museum. The air was stale. Maybe the vibrations from my footsteps had caused the statue to move slightly. But that didn't explain the feeling, the strange sense that I was being watched, the unease creeping down my spine. I reached for my phone to snap a picture, thinking maybe I could capture the strange moment, but as I raised it, the statue's head moved again, a sharp shift, this time, almost as if it were looking directly at my phone. My hand trembled as I lowered it. I couldn't bring myself to take a photo. The idea of documenting it, of proving it, somehow made it all feel too real, too dangerous. I took another step backward, and the statue's head followed me. Slowly, carefully, as though it were moving in tandem with my every motion. Suddenly, I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, to get out of the room, to escape. I turned and nearly ran, my footsteps echoing as I hurried toward the door. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the statue looming in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just the cold, silent room behind me, the empty museum stretching ahead. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the night air cool against my skin, the city's sounds filling the space once again. I stood there for a long moment, catching my breath, trying to shake the strange sense of panic that had taken hold of me. I told myself it was nothing, that I had overreacted, that there was a logical explanation. But I couldn't escape the image of the statue's head shifting, following me with those empty, unblinking eyes. I haven't gone back to that museum since that night. I've passed by it a few times, walking down the same street, but I can't bring myself to look at the building. I don't know what happened in that room, but there's a part of me that knows the statue is still there, still watching. And I'm not sure I ever want to know what it's waiting for. It was a crisp autumn evening when I first noticed it, a column of smoke rising into the sky, curling and twisting, dark and thick against the setting sun. I was walking down my usual route home, the streets familiar, the city noise a constant hum in the background. The air was cool, and the sidewalk was mostly empty, save for the occasional passerby. I had no particular plans, just the simple intent to get home after a long day at work. At first, I thought it was coming from one of the buildings nearby. It was a common sight in the city, after all, someone cooking dinner, a faulty furnace, maybe a bonfire in the distance. But as I continued walking, something caught my attention. The smoke wasn't coming from anywhere familiar. It was rising from a street that didn't exist. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes fixed on the plume of smoke. It seemed to be coming from the corner ahead of me, but there was no building on that corner, just empty space. A vacant lot, covered in overgrown grass and littered with old construction debris. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way smoke could be coming from there. No building, nothing that should have been producing it. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The pedestrians around me were still going about their business. Some on their phones, others talking, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. My heart began to race as I stepped closer to the intersection, my mind scrambling to find an explanation. It had to be some kind of illusion, a trick of the light, or maybe a building I hadn't noticed before. A construction site covered up by temporary barriers. But as I approached the intersection, the smoke became more distinct, its presence undeniable. It was coming from directly behind the lot, a place that shouldn't have been there. I could smell it now, the sharp scent of burning wood, the acrid tang of something deeper, something metallic. It was too real to ignore. I stopped just at the edge of the intersection, staring at the empty lot. The smoke continued to rise, but the strangest thing was how it hung in the air, like it was suspended, as if the source wasn't just a fire but something more unnatural, something that shouldn't have existed at all. My eyes scanned the area again, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing. Just the vacant lot, with its forgotten bricks and weeds. No fire, no building, no explanation. I stepped closer, unable to tear my gaze away. The closer I got, the more pronounced the smoke became, swirling in a way that didn't seem natural. It wasn't dispersing into the air, as it should have. Instead, it lingered in place, thickening, forming something more tangible, something almost alive. And then I saw it, a shape emerging from the smoke. It was brief at first, just a faint outline, like the silhouette of a building forming from nothing. The more I looked, the more I could see the faint shape of a structure, tall and imposing, rising from the empty lot as if it had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The smoke, now darker, swirled around it like a veil, hiding its details. But the outline was unmistakable. The architecture was old, almost Gothic in its design, like something out of a forgotten time. Tall windows, arches, and intricate carvings, all of it appearing as though it had been hidden in plain sight for years. I could barely breathe, my pulse racing in my ears as I stepped back. This wasn't right. It wasn't possible. There was no building there. There hadn't been a building there. I had passed this street every day for months, maybe longer, and never had I seen any sign of a structure like the one emerging from the smoke. I shook my head, convinced I was seeing things, but when I looked again, the building was still there, looming in the haze of the smoke. I turned to look around, to see if anyone else noticed, but no one was reacting. The people walking down the street were oblivious, as if nothing unusual was happening. It was as if I was the only one who could see it. The building was real, but it shouldn't have been. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone to take a picture, but when I glanced at the screen, the image was distorted. The smoke, the building, everything was blurred, as though my camera couldn't capture it. The lens couldn't focus on it. I tried again, but it was the same. The building grew clearer, more defined. The smoke swirled faster, and now I could see details I hadn't before. The windows, dark and uninviting, seemed to reflect the city around me, but with an eerie distortion, as if they were reflecting something else entirely. The doors, massive, looming, looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. I turned away, unable to look at it any longer. I had to leave. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to see this. The air around me felt thick, almost oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was closing in. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me from behind. But when I looked back, the street was empty again. The smoke had disappeared. The building was gone. The lot was just as it had been before, overgrown and forgotten, with nothing but a few scattered pieces of rubble to mark its existence. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know. If it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind, or something else entirely. But when I passed the same spot the next day, the street was just as it had always been, empty, quiet, with no trace of the building, no smoke, nothing. But I can't forget what I saw. The shape of the building, rising from the nothingness, the smoke that didn't make sense, and the feeling that, just for a moment, I had stepped into a place that didn't belong in this world. A place that shouldn't exist, but did. And I can't help but wonder if it will ever return, if it will ever reappear when I least expect it. I was on my usual walk through the city one crisp morning. The kind of morning where the air feels fresh, and the world feels just a little bit quieter. I had passed by this street hundreds of times, the same old bakery I used to frequent when I was younger, when I had more time for pastries and long, leisurely walks. It was tucked between a small cafe and a florist. A cozy little corner shop, with a faded sign that read Maggie's Bakery in warm, welcoming letters. It had been years since I had stepped foot in there. It wasn't that I didn't like the bakery. It was simply that life had gotten busier, and I had lost touch with the small joys of the past. I didn't know exactly when it had closed down, but I remembered the day I passed by and saw the closed for business sign hanging in the window. The door was locked, the lights dim, and the once inviting smell of fresh bread and pastries was replaced with the musty scent of abandonment. That day, I had simply moved on, like everyone else. But today, as I walked down the familiar street, something caught my eye. The door to the bakery was open. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. It was the same door, the same small wooden frame, with the glass window where the sign had once hung, but now it was wide open, inviting anyone to step inside. The lights were on, casting a soft glow over the entrance, and I could see the shelves, lined with trays of freshly baked goods. The smell of bread, warm and yeasty, wafted through the door, just like it used to. I don't know why I hesitated, but I did. I stood there, frozen, for a few moments. The bakery had been closed for years. It had been long enough that I had assumed it would never reopen. I'd heard rumors about the owner. She had retired, or so they said. Maybe she sold the business to someone else, or maybe it was a completely new owner altogether, but the bakery had never reopened, not since that closed for business sign went up. Still, something drew me in. It felt like stepping into a memory I wasn't ready to forget. Something was tugging at me, urging me to go inside. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, and before I knew it, I was standing in the doorway. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered, just like it always used to. The interior of the bakery looked exactly the same, warm, welcoming, with the same wooden tables and mismatched chairs. The shelves were filled with baked goods. Croissants, cinnamon rolls, pies, and bread, all neatly arranged as if they had just been freshly baked that morning. The air was thick with the comforting scent of sugar, flour, and yeast. I took a deep breath, feeling like I had stepped into another time. There was a sense of comfort here, like I had returned to a place that had always been a part of me. But there was something off. Behind the counter, there was a woman I didn't recognize. She had dark hair, tied back in a loose ponytail, and a warm smile as she placed a loaf of bread into a paper bag for a customer. She looked young, too young to be Maggie, but she had the same energy, the same quiet intensity that I remembered. She didn't look at me at first, but I felt her presence, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I walked up to the counter, still unsure of what to say or do. The woman glanced up at me then, her smile still in place, but her eyes were too calm, too knowing. It was as though she had been expecting me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and warm, just like Maggie's used to be. I nodded, feeling slightly awkward. I used to come here a lot. I didn't realize it had reopened. The woman's smile widened, and she nodded, though there was a strange glimmer in her eyes. "Yes, we've been open for a while now," she said, her tone smooth, like she was sharing a secret. "We're always here. It just takes a while for people to remember." I blinked. People to remember, I thought, but I didn't say anything. I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't want to ask. It felt like I had missed something important, but I wasn't sure what it was. I glanced around. The bakery again, taking in the familiar sights, the jars of jam on the shelves, the wooden counter with the chalkboard sign listing the daily specials. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it. It was like no time had passed. But then I noticed something strange. The place was completely empty, except for me and the woman behind the counter. There were no other customers, no other voices. It was too quiet. I felt my skin prickle with unease. I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the oddity of the moment, the bakery that had closed for years, now open again without any explanation. I wasn't sure why, but I had this sudden urge to leave, to walk back out the door and forget this strange encounter altogether. But then I saw it. At the back of the bakery, where the old kitchen used to be, the door was slightly ajar. For just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the shadows, watching me. The figure was blurry, out of focus, but something in the shape of it felt wrong. I turned to the woman at the counter, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's in the back?" I asked, my voice suddenly shaky. The woman's smile faltered, just for a second. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. She didn't answer my question. Instead, she simply gestured to the bread behind her. "Would you like to try something?" she asked, her voice suddenly too bright, too rehearsed. I couldn't get the image of the figure in the back of the bakery out of my mind. It was like I had stepped into a dream, or maybe a memory I wasn't supposed to remember. The unease crept up my spine again, and I turned to leave. But as I stepped toward the door, I glanced at the sign on the front window again, the one that had once said closed for business. The sign was still there, but now it said something different. Closed for good. I froze. It didn't make sense. I had just walked in, and yet it felt as if the bakery had never truly reopened. I turned back to look at the woman, but she was no longer behind the counter. The bakery had gone silent, again. The bread was still warm, the scent of sugar still in the air, but everything had shifted. I didn't look back as I left, walking out of the door and into the dimming light of the evening. The moment I stepped outside, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the bakery still standing, but when I looked there was nothing. The space was empty. No bakery, no sign, just the quiet, empty street, and the eerie feeling that the bakery had never been open at all. It was one of those days when the sky hangs low, thick with clouds, and the air feels heavier than usual. I was out for a walk, taking my usual route across the city, just trying to clear my head after another exhausting week. The weather had kept people indoors, and the streets were quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing against the pavement. It was one of those rare moments of solitude, where everything felt still and I had no particular place to be. I turned down a narrow street I hadn't walked in a while, a route that led me toward an old bridge on the outskirts of the city. The bridge had been there as long as I could remember, crossing over a wide, slow-moving river that separated the quieter part of the city from the busier downtown area. I didn't go across it often, it wasn't the most scenic route, and I preferred the main bridges closer to the heart of the city. But today, something about the weather, the quiet, drew me toward it. When I arrived at the bridge, I saw that it was just as I remembered: an old, rusted structure, its steel beams creaking in the wind. The boards beneath my feet were weathered, warped from years of exposure to the elements, but they still seemed solid. I could hear the faint rush of the river below, but the bridge itself felt abandoned, untouched by time in a way that felt unsettling. I paused before stepping onto the bridge. I'd heard stories as a kid how the bridge had collapsed years ago during a storm, how it had been closed off to traffic ever since. But still, the structure stood, a monument to the past, worn and forgotten. The city had built a newer, sturdier bridge not far from this one, and yet this old bridge remained, standing alone in the distance. I glanced at the signs on either side of the entrance, warning of the bridge's instability, but there was no one around. I looked out over the railing, the fog from the river rising in tendrils. The river's surface was nearly still, reflecting the gray sky above. It felt like I was standing at the edge of something abandoned, a forgotten place, cut off from the rest of the world. I had no reason to cross it. I wasn't in any rush. But something about the bridge, about the way it beckoned in the silence of the city, drew me in. I stepped forward. The wooden planks creaked under my feet, the sound breaking the stillness as I slowly made my way across. With each step, I felt the weight of the bridge beneath me, the sense that it was ancient, like something built long before I was born, and yet it hadn't been destroyed by time. I remembered the rumors from years ago, the storm that had supposedly caused the collapse, the cracks that had appeared in the bridge, the way people had said it was dangerous to cross. But today, it felt steady, almost as if it had been waiting for me. Halfway across, I stopped. Something had shifted. The air was colder now, the quiet thicker. I looked around, but there was no one on the bridge, no sign of life in any direction. I could still hear the faint sounds of the river, but now they seemed distant, as if they were coming from somewhere far below me. The fog had grown heavier, swirling around the base of the bridge, wrapping around the beams in wisps of white. It felt as though I had stepped into a place that existed outside of time, a space where the past and present had somehow collided. I took another step, then another, but when I glanced down at my feet, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The wooden planks beneath me were starting to rot. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to splinter and crack the boards, shifting beneath my weight. I had been walking across the bridge without really paying attention, but now I could feel the structure groaning, as if it were coming to life beneath me, reminding me of its age. The wood had grown soft and brittle, and I wondered how many steps I had left before the bridge gave way entirely. But just as I was about to turn around, to head back to the safety of the solid ground on either side, I noticed something even stranger. At the far end of the bridge, near the entrance I had crossed from, there was movement. A figure, standing still, but unmistakably there. At first I thought it might be a trick of the light, the fog making the shape appear and disappear in flashes. But when I focused, I saw the outline of a man standing at the edge. Facing toward me, his features obscured by the mist. I froze. He didn't move. He didn't look at me, but he was there, standing silently at the end of the bridge. My breath caught in my chest. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for me, watching me, or if he was simply part of the mist itself, but there was something unnerving about him. Something wrong about the way he stood there unmoving, quiet. My heart pounded in my chest. As I watched him, I knew I should turn around, leave the bridge behind, but I couldn't. My feet felt stuck, as if the bridge itself was holding me in place, waiting for me to make a choice. And that was when I heard the sound of a footstep. Behind me, a creak, as though someone was following, stepping lightly across the planks, just as I had. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the space behind me, but there was no one there, just the mist, just the empty space stretching out behind me. I looked back toward the figure at the end of the bridge, but it was gone, just the fog and the fading light where he had been. The feeling of unease intensified. My senses heightened as I suddenly realized I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge was alive, that it was aware of me in a way that I wasn't used to. The history of it, the stories of its collapse, the warnings about its instability, none of it seemed to matter now. It was as though the bridge had been waiting for me, waiting to draw me in. I turned quickly, ready to run, but the planks beneath me cracked again, louder. This time, I felt the bridge shift beneath my feet, and for a moment, I thought it might give way. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, the structure groaning like it was about to fall apart entirely. But then, just as quickly as the fear had gripped me, the noise stopped. The fog parted, and I found myself standing at the other side of the bridge, the land before me solid and firm. The bridge was behind me, silent now, still. I didn't look back as I hurried away, my heart pounding in my chest. And when I reached the end of the street, I stopped, my breath heavy, my eyes wide. The bridge was gone. There was nothing there, not even the faintest trace of it. I don't know how or why it happened, but I know one thing for sure. The bridge collapsed long ago, but I walked across it. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where the world feels a little too calm, and nothing special seems to happen. I had spent most of the morning in the park, walking aimlessly and letting my mind wander. The air was warm. The sun dappled through the leaves, and the sounds of the city felt distant, almost forgotten. After a while, I decided to stop by the corner store on my street to grab a few things: milk, bread, the usual. Nothing that would take more than a few minutes. The store was small, tucked between two old buildings, and it had always been a staple in the neighborhood. The shelves were cramped with food items, and the air inside always smelled faintly of old newspapers and the sweet, metallic tang of canned goods. It wasn't a place I visited often, but it was convenient, and I liked the familiarity of it. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the cool air inside felt like a relief after the warmth of the sun. I grabbed the items I needed quickly and made my way to the counter. The store was nearly empty, just a few other people here and there, but no one I recognized. I paid for my things and turned to leave, the bell above the door ringing again. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, but as I did, I froze. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was still standing in the doorway, staring at the street in front of me, when I saw it. I saw myself walking out of the corner store. It was exactly like how I had just exited, but it couldn't have been me. I was standing still in the doorway, yet I was already on the sidewalk, walking in the opposite direction. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the figure that looked exactly like me kept walking. It was like a mirror image, the same height, the same posture, wearing the same clothes. The figure didn't seem to notice me at all. It just kept walking, unaware of my gaze, heading down the street as if it had no idea I was standing just a few feet away. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. I knew I was standing in the doorway, but there I was, walking down the street, my reflection or whatever it was moving without hesitation. I looked at myself at the figure and then back at the real me, still standing frozen in the doorway. The world felt like it had shifted, the ground beneath me a little too still, too quiet. I could feel the weight of something heavy pressing against my chest. I stepped forward, my feet moving without thinking. I was walking toward the figure, my heart pounding, my mind a swirl of confusion and disbelief. But as I got closer, it vanished just like that. The figure disappeared into thin air. One moment it was there, walking steadily down the street, and the next, it was gone, as if the world had swallowed it up. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming in short gasps. My hands were trembling as I turned back to the store, but when I glanced inside, nothing was different. The bell still jingled softly. The same cashier was behind the counter, the shelves lined with goods. It was the same as it had always been. I was still shaken as I left the store, my thoughts racing. I had to have imagined it. It must have been some kind of strange trick of my mind, a reflection, a daydream. I told myself that over and over, but the feeling didn't go away. It stuck with me, the feeling of having watched myself walk away, the feeling that something had happened just outside the boundaries of the reality I knew, and for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake it. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. Every time I passed a mirror, I'd catch a glimpse of myself, and for just a fraction of a second, I'd feel that same eerie disconnect. Was it really me looking back, or was there someone else? Someone who shouldn't be there, walking beside me, waiting for me to catch up. I didn't tell anyone about it. I don't know why. Maybe because I couldn't explain it. Maybe because I didn't want to sound insane. But every so often, when I'm walking down the street, I wonder if I'll see myself again, walking away from me, heading in a direction I didn't take. And I wonder if I'll ever catch up. It was a warm autumn evening when I first saw her. The city was quiet, the kind of evening where the streets are just a little emptier. the usual hustle of the day winding down into a calm, almost sleepy atmosphere. I had just stepped out of the coffee shop, the last sip of my drink still warm in my hand, when I noticed her standing near the corner. She looked out of place, almost too still among the bustle of the evening crowd. A young woman, dressed in a long weathered coat, her hair tucked under a dark scarf. She was standing at the corner, looking around, as if she were trying to make sense of the street signs or figure out where she was. Something about her posture slightly hunched, as though she were caught in some internal thought seemed out of sync with the surroundings. I was about to walk past her when she suddenly turned and looked directly at me. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear, the words almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure whether she should speak or not. "Can you help me?" I stopped, slightly taken aback by her sudden request. "Sure, what do you need?" I asked, my voice unconsciously warming to her. She shifted her weight slightly, almost as if she were considering how to explain. "I'm trying to get to the Westford Inn," she said, the name flowing from her lips with a strange, almost deliberate calmness. "Do you know how to get there?" I frowned for a moment. The name didn't sound familiar. I was a local, and I spent enough time walking the city's streets to know it pretty well. But this place, the Westford Inn, didn't ring a bell. "I'm sorry," I said, offering a slight smile. "I don't think I've heard of it. Are you sure that's the name?" I pulled out my phone, tapping the screen to search for any information about it. But as I did, I realized I didn't recognize the street she was referring to either. It wasn't showing up anywhere on the map. She nodded, a small, almost relieved smile appearing on her face as though I had finally understood. "It's a little tucked away," she explained, "but it's in the old part of the city. You know, near the old theater. It's not far from here. It should be just a block or so away." I looked around, unsure of what to say. "The old theater," I repeated, trying to place the name. There had been an old theater down the street a few years ago, but it had been closed for ages, its building crumbling. The idea of a hoteler inn being located nearby felt off. "Actually," I said, a little unsure now, "I think there used to be an old theater there, but I haven't heard of any inns or hotels around here." She seemed to not hear my confusion, her eyes brightening with a kind of quiet certainty. "It's just beyond the corner," she said, pointing further down the street. Though when I glanced down the road, I saw only the fading light of the street lamp reflecting off empty storefronts. I shook my head, feeling a strange chill creep into the conversation. "I'm not sure I know where it is," I said slowly, "but I can walk with you a little bit and help you find your way." Her smile didn't waver, but there was something faintly unsettling about the way she looked at me, like she was already miles away, her focus distant despite her presence right in front of me. "That's kind of you, but I'll be fine. I just need to head down this street a little more, and I'll be there. I know where I'm going." Her voice was soft, but there was an undertone of finality, as if the matter were already settled. Before I could respond, she nodded and gave a small, almost imperceptible bow of her head. "Thank you for your time. I'll find it now." She turned away from me and started walking down the street, her figure quickly blending into the growing darkness of the evening. I stood there for a moment, watching her recede into the night, the sound of her footsteps faint against the quiet city. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I glanced at my phone again, but still, there was nothing about the Westford Inn anywhere. No street name, no reference. I waited for a moment, then, curiosity tugging at me, I decided to follow her, just to make sure she wasn't wandering into the wrong area. I moved quickly to catch up, but as I turned the corner where she had walked, I saw nothing. No sign of her. Just the empty street, the lights flickering in the distance. Confused, I glanced around, walking the length of the block, checking the nearby alleyways, but there was no trace of her. It was as though she had simply vanished. I felt a pang of unease, but I told myself it was nothing, just another odd encounter, nothing to worry about. But as I turned to walk back toward the main road, I caught sight of something that made my stomach drop. The same old theater building that had been long abandoned, its windows boarded up and covered in layers of dust, suddenly had its lights on. Not bright, not glowing like a welcoming sign, but faint, like a flickering candle from behind closed curtains. I moved closer, my steps now hesitant, my breath quickening. I knew that building. I'd walked past it 1,000 times, and yet, now, it was different. There was an energy to it that wasn't there before. The lights behind the boarded-up windows weren't something I had imagined they were there, faint and flickering, as if someone was inside. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A small, weathered sign that I'd never noticed before. It hung near the door, half hidden in the shadows, almost like it had been waiting for me. The words were barely legible, faded by time, but there it was, the Westford Inn. I froze. The door was slightly ajar now, a crack of light spilling out from the inside. The scent of something familiar, sweet and musky, like old wood and cinnamon, filled the air. I took a hesitant step forward, but something stopped me, something in the air that told me I wasn't meant to go any further. I turned quickly, looking around, but there was no sign of the woman anymore, no trace of her at all. I never went back to look at the building again. I don't know what happened that night, but every time I walk down that street, I glance at the building from the corner of my eye, half expecting to see the sign again, or her standing at the door, waiting. But the only thing I know for sure is that I've never seen the Westford Inn again. No one else has mentioned it, and when I ask about it, people look at me like I'm crazy, like I've made it up, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still smell the scent of cinnamon and old wood in the air. Maybe it was just a dream, but I'm not so sure anymore. It started as a typical Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the city feels a little quieter than usual. I had just finished work, the kind of day that drags on longer than you expect, and I was looking forward to heading home. I didn't have any particular plans, just the usual drive through the city streets to my apartment. The evening rush was still ongoing, the headlights of cars blurring together in the distance, casting long streaks of light along the road. I pulled onto the main road, my mind still half on the thoughts I had left behind at the office, when I noticed something strange. The traffic sign ahead, one of those digital ones that display speed limits, flashed for a brief moment, but the numbers were different from what I expected. Instead of the usual reminder to slow down, or the temporary change in speed limits for construction, the sign blinked something that made me pause. Asterisk speed limit, 25 miles per hour. My name, asterisk. I blinked, unsure of what I had just seen. My name was there. My full name, clearly displayed on the traffic sign. I glanced around, but the road was still the same. I wasn't near any construction zones, and I didn't see anything unusual in the surroundings. It had to be some kind of mistake, right? Maybe a glitch in the system. I chuckled nervously to myself, thinking I was just overtired. I continued driving, but the sign changed again as I passed under it. Now it read, "*turn left, for my name." I gripped the steering wheel, the unease creeping up my spine. This can't be real. There was no way that traffic signs were supposed to change like that. And yet, there it was. I turned left anyway, instinctively following the direction. I didn't know why, but I did. As I drove, the lights ahead seemed to grow dimmer, and I could feel the air around me growing thicker, heavier. The streets were quieter than I remembered, the usual hum of traffic fading into an eerie silence. I looked at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but it was just the dark road behind me, stretching into the night. And then, as I passed another traffic sign, it flashed again. "*turn right now, my name." My heart was racing. The sign wasn't just showing my name now. It was instructing me, as if it knew where I was supposed to go, what I was supposed to do. I hesitated, a part of me screaming to turn around, to go back the way I came, but the curiosity, the need to understand, overpowered the fear. I turned right. The street I was on now was unfamiliar. It wasn't a road I usually traveled, not even one that had been on my regular route home. It was narrow, dimly lit, with trees lining both sides that created a kind of tunnel effect as I drove further. The buildings around me felt run down, almost as though they were from a different time, a forgotten part of the city that no one paid attention to anymore. The road stretched on longer than I had anticipated. I glanced at the signs that had once given me directions, but now they were just blank, dark, with no words at all. I kept driving, the unease growing into something more tangible, a knot tightening in my stomach, and then I saw it. Another traffic sign, but this one was different from the others. It was much older, its edges rusted and worn, as though it had been here for years, decades, maybe. The words on it were faint, nearly unreadable, but I could make out the text as I slowed down. "*end of road for my name." I stopped the car right there, my heart hammering in my chest. The sin was so old, so weathered. It didn't belong on this street. It didn't belong anywhere. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but the road ended abruptly, just a wall of overgrown trees and dense foliage where the street should have continued. I sat there, staring at the sign, my mind racing. "*end of road." End of what road? I turned around, ready to go back. But before I could shift the car into reverse, I saw something that froze me in place. At the far end of the street, near where the road ended, a figure stood. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but I could see the silhouette of a person, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know if it was someone who had been following me, or if it was just a trick of the dim light. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring into the darkness. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. I felt like I was being drawn to it, like the figure was waiting for me. The next thing I knew, My car was moving. My hands were on the steering wheel, but I wasn't the one guiding it. It was as if I was being pulled forward, drawn toward that figure, my foot pressing on the accelerator without my consent. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew what was about to happen. I didn't want to move forward, but I couldn't stop. My hands felt numb. The car moved, turning toward the figure, the road ahead narrowing, and just as the car reached the end of the street, everything went black. The headlights flickered, then died completely. The sound of the engine sputtered, and the car coasted to a stop, the eerie silence filling the air. I was alone in the darkness, unable to move, unable to think. The figure had disappeared, and I was left in the stillness, trapped at the end of a road that had never truly existed. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on my usual route, the street signs returning to normal. The traffic around me was as busy as ever, and the world outside my window was bright and alive again. I blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but it all felt like a dream, a strange, haunting dream that I couldn't shake. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know why the signs showed my name, or why I ended up on that road. But every time I pass a traffic sign now, I can't help but glance at it, half expecting it to change, half expecting it to call my name again. And sometimes, when the world feels too quiet, I swear I hear a voice whispering, just faintly telling me the road is waiting for me.